During the last 2 or 3 days of May, everyone knew the Gambier Bay was about to sail. Trucks brought fresh provisions, a sure sign of departure within 72 hours. Word got out that grape juice was a good vitamin supplement, and the officers went out by the dozen to buy grape juice at the Navy Exchange. The enlisted men also had juice on their minds, but of another sort. Some men came aboard carrying bottles of Three Feathers whiskey, gin, and such, which were promptly confiscated by the officers of the deck. Naval regulations prohibited the consumption of alcohol except for medical purposes. Some men came aboard with mysterious bulges at waist, armpit, or trouser leg, all of which had to be investigated, usually to the discomfiture of the smugglers. A store of beer was brought aboard legally and promptly locked up in the ship's brig, which was never used for any other purpose. The beer would be drunk at liberty parties off-ship later. Junior officers and enlisted men still did not know where they were going, but had a pretty good idea from the scuttlebutt. On May 30th, 2 Marine passengers boarded the Gambier Bay, and a crated Stinson 049 Grasshopper observation plane was hoisted aboard. It was clear to everyone that it was to be an invasion. By the end of the day, with the invasion forces masked, Admirals Nimitz and Spruance were confident enough to risk a breach in security by calling the senior fleet officers and brief them on Operation Forager. Admiral Spruance was in command. The Joint Expeditionary Force would be commanded by Admiral Kelly Turner, who by this time, after experience at Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls, was the world's foremost expert on amphibious operations. The small carriers would support the landings, while the fast carrier force under Admiral Mark Mitcher and the land-based Air Force under Admiral John Hoover moved far afield to destroy any enemy aircraft or warships that threatened the invasion forces. The force consisted of 535 ships, more than 1,000 carrier aircraft, and 127,500 troops. Once the troops were ashore, they would come under the command of General Holland M. Smith, the Marine Chief of Nimitz's ground forces in the Central Pacific. The Gambier Bay was going to cover the Saipan and Tinian invasions of the 5th Amphibious Corps, which consisted of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. Another force would attack Guam. At that briefing, the major target, Saipan, was revealed. As far as the Americans knew, they estimated that 15,000 Japanese defenders would face them on Saipan. The actual figure was 32,000 troops. They also underestimated the nature and extent of the enemy's defensive establishment, and above all, the Japanese Naval High Command's reaction, which would be to send its combined fleet against the Americans. But that was the big picture, and as far as the Gambier Bay and Composite Squadron 10 were concerned, they would be part of a fleet of 4 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts that would cover the beaches of the Saipan and Tinian attack force. First, the fast carriers would move in and plaster Saipan, Tinian, Rota, Guam, and Pagan. Then Hoover's land-based airplanes would strike Truk, Wolai, and Yap to prevent the Japanese there from sending reinforcements to the Marianas. The fast carriers by this time would be hitting Iwo Jima and Chichijima to prevent air assistance from moving south. Admiral Mitcher's 15 carriers would mount more than 800 planes for this purpose. The strikes would actually begin on June 11th, and on June 13th, the Gambier Bay and the other ships of the Saipan invasion force would be in position. The old battleships and cruisers would begin the firing, and the air squadron would begin bombing Saipan to soften up the enemy. On June 14th, the troops would land, and Composite Squadron 10's job would be to cover them and provide air support for the invaders and the invasion fleet. All this would begin for the men of the Gambier Bay on May 31st. Early that morning she would weigh anchor and move out. All liberty would end at 9 p.m. on May 30th. May 30th dawned as Memorial Day, the holiday to honor Americans dead in a war nearly 100 years before. Commander Ballinger managed to secure leave for any and all men who wanted to go ashore, as long as the watches were covered. When that word came, the ship began to empty. An enormous beer party was held by enlisted men ashore, and the officers trooped over to the Barbers Point Club for a last fling. But not all of them. A few, like Ensign Pizarski, were affected by the solemnity of the holiday and the enormity of what lay before them. Pisarski headed across Ford Island to Battleship Row and looked down into the water at the hulk of the USS Arizona. There she was, the broad deck outline visible, but only her superstructure rising to the surface. She had gone down, he remembered, on the very day he had soloed for the first time in an airplane at Butler Municipal Field outside Pittsburgh. It was a very solemn young ensign who turned away. Ensign Pisarski began to walk back to the Gambier Bay, reflecting on the upcoming journey and his place in the unfolding conflict. That evening he remained ashore until after dark, lying on the grass near the ship and listening to the sounds of loading. As he looked up at the stars, he prayed for divine protection through the long journey ahead. Suddenly he was jolted from his reverie by the sound of the squawk box. "Ensign Pisarski, report to the quarterdeck. It's time to go." Captain Goodwin instructed Navigator Gorn to set the course for Roy and Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, which had been captured 5 months earlier and turned into a staging base for the fleet. Gorn, unfamiliar with the area due to its previous status as part of Japan's Forbidden Empire, relied heavily on Ensign Albang, a reserve officer with expertise in navigation. Before Gorn left the captain's cabin, Captain Goodwin had an additional task: prepare a Napier diagram. Gorn, though he may have done this in his academy days, had probably forgotten the complexities involved. The Napier diagram required precise plotting of data, including compass deviation, magnetic readings, and variation to obtain a true heading in case the ship's gyroscope failed. The navigation department regarded this task as just another challenge designed to keep them sharp. Gorn mentioned nothing more about the Napier diagram, and Ensign Bayang spent hours with his slide rule and logarithm charts to produce the diagram by the morning of departure. As usual, Captain Goodwin took his coffee on the bridge as the land faded away. His steward, Junior, brought the captain's silver service and 2 cups in case Commander Boris or another officer were called to the bridge. The captain drank from a single cup and sent Junior back below. Junior, a dark-skinned native of Guam, was relegated to stewardship under the Naval Code, but longed to be a sailor. He was greeted warmly by the bridge crew, who teased him about steering the ship. In great glee, Junior took the helm, under the supervision of the helmsman, boatman's mate, quartermaster, and bugler. As Junior steered the ship, 3 sets of hands eagerly reached for the captain's coffee, a known favourite on the Gambier Bay. Captain Goodwin, focused on the upcoming battle, was unaware of the antics on the bridge. His mind was set on more critical matters, such as the training and preparation needed for the impending action. The Gambier Bay and Kitkan Bay began launching planes in a battle exercise, involving various flight deck activities. The crew worked diligently, despite some grumbling from fighter pilots about the necessity of catapults for their planes. Down in the mess hall, Seaman Henry Quinn was organising a game of dice in the Spud locker, a favourite spot for those looking for privacy and a chance to gamble. Quinn, who had taken on the role of gunner on a 20mm gun, stashed his dice and headed to his battle station as the alarm rang through the ship. The Gambier Bay's flight deck was soon bustling with planes preparing to launch, and the ship circled in operation with the Kitkun Bay. As dusk approached, the planes were called in, and the Gambier Bay joined a large force, including old battleships and transport ships. On the morning of June 1st, Captain Goodwin addressed the crew at general quarters, informing them of their imminent entry into battle. The Gambier Bay's task was to cover the Marines during their landing on Saipan, with expectations of attacks by Japanese planes and possibly ships. The captain expressed confidence in American might and the inevitability of victory, noting that the Japanese would remember Pearl Harbor. That afternoon, as the Gambier Bay approached Saipan, the men received a general message from Admiral Nimitz, wishing them good hunting and good luck. With 10 days before the action began, the crew could use all the luck they could get. On June 2nd, as Composite Squadron 10's planes prepared for their daily exercises, a serious accident occurred when the guns of one fighter accidentally discharged, injuring an aircrew member in 3 places. The Kitcon Bay and the Gambier Bay were tasked with daily anti-submarine and combat air patrols to safeguard their convoy from Japanese attacks. The other planes from the 2 carriers participated in war games, including aerial rendezvous and simulated attacks on their own ships. While these exercises went off without major issues on June 2nd and 3, the following days brought new challenges. On June 4th, Lieutenant Owen Wheeler had to ditch his torpedo plane in the water, but a nearby destroyer rescued him and his crew. By June 6th, weather conditions became rough, and Ensign Zola described his flight as one of the most harrowing he had experienced. Unfortunately, he also lost 2 friends from the Kitcon Bay, one who crashed during takeoff and another who was killed on landing. On the same day, the Gambier Bay's landing signal officer, Lieutenant McClendon, struggled with the carrier pitching and tossing in rising seas. Lieutenant Bob Weatherholt's torpedo plane was unable to land on the carrier and had to ditch in the sea. His radio man, P.E. Collins, became the squadron's first aircrew casualty when he failed to escape the sinking plane. By June 7th, the pilots were on edge due to the recent incidents. The engine failure experienced by Wheeler and Weatherholt's similar trouble heightened their concerns about the reliability of their planes. Lieutenant Bassett's torpedo bomber displayed similar symptoms immediately after launch, with black smoke indicating an oil problem. He returned to the carrier, and Captain Goodwin, initially shocked by the unexpected return, was reassured by McClendon, who understood the issue. Chief Montgomery discovered that the oil return line was dangerously close to parting, a problem that could have led to a frozen engine and further losses. Despite these setbacks, the torpedo bombers were checked and the pilots began to regain confidence as no further incidents occurred. However, their numbers had dwindled from 12 to 10 bombers, while the fighter pilots numbered 19. The daily routine at sea involved early morning alerts for combat air and anti-submarine patrols, with non-flying crew members spending their time in various activities such as reading, playing cards, or napping. Food aboard varied widely, with officers enjoying steaks and ice cream, while the enlisted men's mess faced complaints over its quality. Eventually, the situation improved after complaints led to a change in the ship's culinary staff. On June 7th, Lieutenant Bell briefed the ship's company on their upcoming mission, reiterating the importance of anti-submarine and combat air patrols for the safety of the Saipan landing force. He also reminded them of the risks posed by Japanese submarines, noting the recent sinking of the Lissam Bay. Another incident occurred when a plane captain, attempting to mimic a combat pilot, accidentally fired a .50 caliber gun. The resulting damage included pierced flight deck and injuries to several men below. On June 8th, the Gambier Bay anchored at Royal, amidst a massive armada of American ships. The fleet included 7 battleships, 8 cruisers, 4 carriers, and around 30 destroyers. The Gambier Bay's crew loaded supplies and ammunition for the impending fight. The crew received news of promotions, with several junior officers advancing in rank, including Ensign Pizarski, who was promoted to lieutenant junior grade. On June 9th, the Gambier Bay continued to load supplies, but the process was interrupted 3 times due to reports of Japanese planes snooping around, although they did not make a significant appearance. The Marianas invasion operation, known as Forager, was underway, with Admiral Spruance's flagship, the cruiser Indianapolis, overseeing the 15 carriers of the fast carrier force. Captain Goodwin and Commander Boris attempted to secure replacement torpedo bombers for those lost during the voyage, but were met with a cheerful no from the supply officer, who noted that all available planes had already been allocated. The day also featured a boxing show organised by Lieutenant J.W. Patterson, which served as a distraction for the crew. The ring was set up on the forward elevator, with the crew watching from the hangar deck and flight deck. The event, complete with music from the ship's band and a performance by aviation machinist John Smurder, offered a brief respite from the tension. On the same day, the last mail was delivered to censoring officers for shipment back to the United States. By the evening of June 9th, it was clear that the time had run out. On June 10th, the Saipan invasion fleet set sail from Royal, with the Gambier Bay and its accompanying carriers prepared for the mission. The morning began early with a general quarters call at 4:30 a.m., as the crew and pilots of Composite Squadron 10 readied themselves for action. Captain Goodwin delivered an inspiring pep talk over the loudspeaker, which Quartermaster Bell found particularly motivating. The crew had breakfast at their action stations, and the ship was secured at 9 a.m., allowing the invasion force to move out. Throughout the day, the Gambier Bay's planes conducted anti-submarine and combat air patrols, with other escort carriers sharing the responsibility for the fleet's protection. By the afternoon, Lieutenant Vine Bell updated the crew on the nature of Saipan and Tinian Islands, along with details about Japanese defences. Soon after, the combat air patrol reported 2 Japanese planes, one of which was shot down while the other escaped into the clouds, heightening vigilance among the invasion fleet. At 3 p.m., Gambier Bay launched 4 fighters for combat air patrol and torpedo bombers for anti-submarine patrols. Despite thorough searching, no submarines were found on this day or the next. However, on June 13th, a torpedo bomber pilot reported spotting a periscope and dropped depth charges, prompting destroyers to attack the area. An oil slick on the surface suggested the potential sinking or damaging of an enemy submarine. On June 13th, Gambier Bay's combat air patrol was relieved by the Kitkun Bay's fighters, who shortly thereafter reported a Japanese Betty bomber. Although the initial reports indicated the bomber had disappeared in the clouds, it was later confirmed that it had been shot down, causing a cheer among the crew. That afternoon, Captain Goodwin connected the ship's communication system to the public address system so that the crew could follow the action of their task force. By June 14th, the Gambier Bay was positioned 30 miles off Saipan, and Composite Squadron 10 was preparing for attacks after dark. At 11 p.m., the ship's radar picked up a blip at 4,000 yards, which led to a destroyer being dispatched to investigate. The destroyer engaged the target, which returned fire before disappearing. The destroyer reported an oil slick, suggesting the possible sinking of a submarine. Records from both Japanese and American sources suggest that submarines may have been sunk on the nights of June 13th and 14. On the morning of June 15th, airstrikes commenced, with the Gambier Bay launching missions against targets on Saipan. Despite light anti-aircraft fire, the first attacks were successful, though Lieutenant Stewart's Wildcat was hit and had to be abandoned. Stewart was rescued but would not return to the Gambier Bay for 2 weeks. Lieutenant James F. Oliver took over as acting fighter squadron commander. Throughout the day, pilots flew support missions, with Composite Squadron 10's fighters conducting strafing runs and bombers attacking targets with fragmentation bombs. The landing at Saipan commenced at 8:44 a.m., with intense Japanese resistance. Despite heavy bombardment and air attacks, the Japanese defences proved resilient, and the Marines faced significant opposition, leading to a call for additional support. The day ended with Tokyo Rose broadcasting warnings of imminent defeat, which the crew of the Gambier Bay dismissed with laughter. However, a general alarm later that night indicated a potential attack. The crew, despite their fear and anxiety, showed a heightened sense of camaraderie and respect, with many writing letters to loved ones and attending religious services. By June 15th, the situation was tense, with the men of the Gambier Bay dealing with the stress of battle while also facing the uncertainty of what lay ahead. On June 16, 1944, the men of the Gambier Bay were awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning. The alarm bell rang over loudspeakers throughout the ship, clang, clang, clang. The bugler blew the call to general quarters, and the bosun called, "Man your battle stations!" Lieutenant Greenfield, the assistant supply officer, was sleeping in his underwear because of the heat. He groped for the light above his bunk, found his shoes, and slipped into them. He grabbed his trousers and shirt from the end of the bunk, struggled into them with shirt tails flying, and grabbed his life preserver in one hand and his awkward gun belt with the .45 Colt automatic in the other. Then he fumbled for his steel helmet as well. He dashed for his battle station, racing against the men dogging down the watertight doors. Panting, he reached his station, one of the port batteries of anti-aircraft guns, and began counting the noses of his men. A little later, the captain explained that the enemy had been picked up on the radar screen about 60 miles out. Radar, the great boon from the British, made all the difference. The ship was alert long before any enemy could approach, but this group of enemy planes apparently had business elsewhere. After moving into a point 10 miles off the carrier to seaward, the enemy changed course and moved away. Still, the captain kept the ship at general quarters until 7 o'clock. By that time, the strike had left the Gambier Bay to assist the Marines on the beaches. Later in the day, some of the torpedo bombers carried supplies and ammunition for the troops. 20,000 men had been landed, but they were moving slowly against strong opposition. Early in the morning, the Japanese launched a banzai attack. Officers, screaming that they would drive the Marines into the sea, brandished their samurai swords and came down the hills. But Marine tanks and troops stopped the attack, and by the time the Japanese had reformed their forces, the airstrikes were beginning. On the radio circuit, Quartermaster Bell heard two of the Gambier Bay's torpedo bomber pilots arguing about which one would have the privilege of going down and destroying an enemy truck and a squad of men. One of them yielded, and the other was off the air for a few moments before coming back to report, "No more truck, no more Japanese." A good deal of romantic talk developed during the day. The fact was that the going was extremely difficult for the Marines, but Admiral Turner was not advertising that fact. So the impression in the fleet was that this invasion was a walkaway. The planes struck Garapan, the principal town on the island, and set fire to the cane fields. The explosions and fires gave a satisfactory feeling of success, but actually did relatively little damage to the defence effort. That day, the torpedo bombers were loaded with 500-pound bombs and assigned to find and destroy enemy artillery, which was pounding the Marines who were moving toward Ato Airfield. East of the airfield, Lieutenant Peacy's radio man, Jerry Falls, spotted 4 small guns placed at the points of a square. He thought perhaps a big gun might be in the middle, camouflaged, and told Peasy it might be worth an attack. Peasy nosed the bomber over the 4 anti-aircraft guns, for that is what they were, began firing, but he dove through the flak and bombed. Behind him came 2 other bombers. All 3 500-pound bombs struck the target and wiped out a piece of heavy artillery. It would take more than air power to win control of these islands, however. The fast carriers learned this much on June 16th, when they sent planes against Guam and Tinian to neutralize the airfields there. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was strong and accurate, and a number of carrier planes were shot down. On Saipan, the pilots of the Gambier Bay did not seem to have the same difficulty, perhaps because the big guns of the battleships and cruisers were available to keep the anti-aircraft gunners down. For the men of the Gambier Bay, June 16th was a relatively quiet day. June 17th would be a little different. It began with a routine call to general quarters an hour before sunrise. The captain then got on the public address system with some exciting news. The Japanese fleet was out. One of the reasons for attacking the Marianas, he told the men, was to draw the Japanese combined fleet into open battle. A dozen Japanese carriers were coming at them from the Philippines, and so Admiral Spruance had ordered the fast carriers and fast battleships to go get them. They had gone off, leaving the escort carriers the entire job of supporting the landings. So far, at least to Quartermaster Bell, this had been too easy. He estimated that the whole of Admiral Spruance's escort carrier command had lost only 6 planes, which was about right. And with the word that Lieutenant Stewart had been picked up, the Gambier Bay had not yet lost an airman. The Japanese had indeed launched their strike, which they hoped would be decisive in their favour. They called it the AO Plan, and its purpose was to tempt the American fleet in the area south of the Marianas. But when the Americans attacked Saipan, Vice Admiral Ozawa, the fleet commander, was forced to act. The Marianas were only 1,500 miles from Japan, and public opinion would be shocked if the enemy invaded this ring of the empire. Admiral Ozawa's force was smaller than Admiral Mitchell's, and the American carrier planes outnumbered the Japanese by 2-1. but the Japanese fully expected to have the support of more than 500 aircraft sent previously to the Marianas, the Pala, and other islands in the area. Their planes, which were not armoured, were lighter than the American and had greater range. Finally, Ozawa had the weather gauge. As long as the easterly trade wind held, he could launch and recover planes while approaching the enemy, while the Americans had to turn into the wind to launch and recover, which meant turning the wrong way. On June 17th, Admiral Spruance was getting ready for battle and issued his battle orders. But the men of the Gambier Bay knew virtually nothing about this major action. Their job was to stick with the invasion and protect the ships and the troops. On June 17th, operations continued as they had for 2 days. The Gambier Bay now carried a marine observer who flew in the Grasshopper with Captain Gould, the pilot, and kept in communication with the ground. But on the night of June 16th, his contact with his counterpart on the island had been broken off, and he worried that this man might be dead. He wanted to get down to Ito that day. Although only part of the field was held by the Marines, he asked Captain Goodwin for the use of a torpedo bomber and pilot for the mission. Captain Goodwin assigned Peasky the task. The torpedo bomber took off from the Gambier Bay, and on the way to Ito, the Marine officer briefed Peasky on the approach he must take to avoid friendly fire, a very low pass over the channel between Saipan and Tinian. The field was rough and full of potholes caused by artillery, but the Marines had filled a path 50 feet wide, and it was possible to land. They landed safely, and the observer warned Peasky to move fast and keep his head down, since pilots were a favourite Japanese target. Since no planes had landed on Ito yet, Peasky wondered how he knew. He listened, not quite believing. "As you leave the plane, run ahead of me and keep your head down," said the observer. "Sure," said Peasky, and he proceeded to stop halfway along their transit to stare at the first Japanese prisoners of war he had ever seen. Immediately a zing passed his right ear, and he was tackled from behind. It was the observer. "For Christ's sake, lie low and keep your head down!" Marine machine gunners began peppering the trees across the runway. They must have shot the sniper because a few moments later someone signalled them to go on in. The observer went to find the commander, and Peasky was directed to the mess hall to wait. The Marines had not been in occupancy of the territory for 24 hours, but they had already adapted the Japanese facilities and were socked in. He was befriended in the mess hall by a Marine cook who was making doughnuts. The cook glanced at Peasky's name on the brown patch of his breast and smiled. "I'm a Pok too," he said from Milwaukee. "So, the Navy Pok." The Marine Powak exchanged anecdotes about their service careers. "Your first combat?" asked the Marine. Pisarsky nodded. "Where was yours?" "Tarawa." The Marine gave Pisarsky a bottle of sake and a bag of fresh doughnuts, which would certainly prove to the ready room that Pisarsky was the first Navy pilot to land on Saipan. Then the observer returned, and Pisarsky took him back to the Gambier Bay. They landed on the carrier, and when the engines stopped, they got out. From time to time, over the radio, they had heard reports of action by the combat air patrol, but the ships of the carrier force had not been bothered. Still, the observer and Captain Gould decided that the time had come for them to leave. The Marine commander at Ito had said the field would be totally secure in another few hours, and that the observer might as well begin operating from Ito on the morning of the 18th. So the Grasshopper found a new home. The observer went below to pick up his kit, and Captain Gould got the little plane ready for takeoff. When the observer came up on the flight deck again, Lieutenant Peasky stopped to say goodbye. "How many spotting missions have you flown?" asked the junior lieutenant. The other man looked at him with a calm and businesslike eye. "Oh, about 280 hours, he said. "That goes back quite a ways," said Pisarsky. "Yes," said the observer, "back to Guadalcanal." So that was how the observer knew about the sniper. Other than that, the Gambier Bay and Composite Squadron 10 had a relatively uneventful day. At least that was true until 6 o'clock in the evening. As dusk was settling in, the call to general quarters sounded again. The men had settled into a sort of routine by this time, and most of them believed the signal was no more than standard dusk routine. But this time there was more. Chaplain Carlson's general quarters station was on the bridge with the captain, and his assignment was to be the talker to give the ship's crew a blow-by-blow account of activity during battle. It soon became apparent that Chaplain Carlson was going to get his feet wet as interlocutor. The Combat Information Center reported that Japanese planes, or bogies, were heading toward them but were still 60 miles away. The Gambier Bay had just recovered her combat air patrol after 4 hours of flight, and the decks were cluttered. One of the Wildcats had crashed into the barrier on landing when he bounced, and his tailhook failed to engage the arresting gear. Aviation machinist's mate. Third-class PNC was working with the air crew to prepare to slide the fighter over the side so they could clear the decks in a hurry. A carrier with a fouled deck was always the enemy's choice for attack, and Captain Goodwin gave them a sense of urgency. The combat air patrol was launched by another of the escort carriers. Then came a second report. More bogies at 126 miles, and a third. More Japanese planes at 40 miles. That third group kept closing, 40, 35, 30, 25 miles, 24 miles. At that point, the combat air patrol intercepted the Japanese bombers and shot down several of them, but the others came on in. At 6:50 p.m., they launched an attack on the Gambier Bay. As they came, Lieutenant Bell at least recognized them as Judies, Japanese dive bombers. A ramp was set up, and the fighter was slid over the catwalk on the port side. As they pushed the plane, the specialists were cannibalizing it. The radio men stripped out their gear, and Peniak climbed into the cockpit to salvage as much of the oxygen equipment as he could. In a few moments, the fighter slid over the side and the deck was cleared, not a moment too soon. For just then, the 20 mm and 40 mm guns forward on the starboard catwalk began firing. Peniak saw a black shape hurtling down, and tracers churning the water alongside the ship. One moment he was standing on the deck, and the next he was lying full length in a light lock for the protection it would give him. He did not see a bomb, but felt it go off, and the ship shudder from the impact. He popped his head out of the light lock to see what was going on. Quartermaster Bell was at the helm when the talker reported the Japanese aircraft at 10 miles. He began straining his eyes. It was hard to see in the growing darkness, but then his eye caught a flash of motion, and there it was, a bomber coming down on them. The gunners saw the airplane and began firing. The plane came in on the bow. On the bridge, Captain Goodwin looked up, watched the Japanese bomber, and raised his right arm to measure the angle of deflection of the bomb. He saw it start down and waited as it came. Then, at the last moment, he gave the order, hard to starboard. On the deck below, Quartermaster Bell swung the wheel as fast as he could move his hands, and the carrier turned. The bomb kept coming, and Quartermaster Bell could see it miss narrowly, just off the port bow. Then came another and another. The captain ordered the helm to move so that all 3 bombs missed the ship. All this time, Chaplain Carlson was on the bridge, carrying on a play-by-play report for the men below who could not see the action. The men below could certainly hear. Quartermaster Bell said he was virtually deafened by the sound of the ship's guns all firing at the bombers overhead. "We got him!" shouted Chaplain Carlson. Bell looked up to see a Japanese plane hit the water and explode in flame. Then came another shout from the chaplain and another. All those weeks of training, all the dry runs and hours spent learning nomenclature and the method of taking apart the guns and putting them together, all these apparently useless exercises now paid off. The young men at the 20 mm and 40 mm guns suddenly discovered that they knew how to use their weapons and fired them with remarkable accuracy for first-timers in combat. As the captain's skillful manoeuvring of the ship showed his experience, so did the shooting down of 2 torpedo bombers show how training had paid off for the men of the Gambier Bay. Yes, men, some of them had still not turned 18, but they were men that day. Lieutenant Rick Robbie was strapped in his Wildcat on the catapult when the bombs fell. So close by the fin of one landed against the right wheel of the plane. Enan Zar was sitting on one wing of the plane at that moment, and Lieutenant Pilgrim, the catapult officer, was sitting on the other. Both were splashed by the spray from the bomb blast and jumped down from their perches, soaking wet. Excitedly, Chaplain Carlson continued his account as the Japanese planes fell. One last plane came under fire by a destroyer and was shot down. Then the guns ceased firing. The Gambier Bay had emerged virtually unscathed. 4 men were hit by flying shrapnel from the near misses, and 1 man sprained his ankle in the excitement, but the Japanese attack had failed. The Gambier Bay had credit for 2 planes shot down by her gunners. The Gambier Bay had launched her fighters to help drive off the Japanese attackers, and by the time the combat ended, it was quite dark. So the fighter pilots and Lieutenant McClendon had a new exercise: night landings under combat conditions. Captain Goodwin turned the ship into the wind, seeming as close to the 19-knot limit as he could because of the lack of breeze. McClendon brought out his iridescent suit to match his paddles. He brought all the men in safely but 1. That pilot landed in the water and was saved, although the fighter was lost. All in all, as the ship was secured for the night, the men of the Gambier Bay could look back on a very successful day, except for 1 new loss suffered that evening. Enan and Lee Geyer did not return with the others and were initially reported missing. It was later learned, however, that his Wildcat had been shot down while chasing those bombers, not by an enemy airman, but by the now celebrated anti-aircraft gunners of Tinian. He managed a water landing near a destroyer and was picked up, and the word was passed that he would be coming back to the squadron. Relief at this news made the day seem even better. Then came more good news from Admiral Spruance's flagship. The beachhead was safe. Saipan was far from taken. In the air attacks that evening, a landing craft had been hit by a torpedo, and a landing ship tank was set on fire in that same attack. But she was saved. Shaw Bay had received a bomb hit that exploded on the hangar deck, killing 11 men and forcing that carrier back to Eno for repairs. However, the Marines were ashore, and with the help of the Gambier Bay, they would remain there. The men of the Gambier Bay, from the lowest swabby to the captain, were dedicated to delivering that help and were also certain that God was on their side. Chaplain Carlson, however, wanted to give God all the help he could, and his commentaries from the bridge were no less than inspirational. That night he signed off after the Japanese air attack. All enemy aircraft are burning satisfactorily. The Japanese had discovered that ships at sea were most vulnerable in the hour just before dawn and just after sunset. These were the times when they pressed home their most vigorous attacks. On June 18th, the men of the Gambier Bay were aroused by an alarm and bugle at 4:10 in the morning. Japanese aircraft were on the radar screen. One group came within 7 miles of the Gambier Bay, but none closed on the fleet of carriers operating off the eastern shore of Saipan. The ship was secured from general quarters at 7 o'clock, and the normal battle day began. From before dawn, the hangar deck and flight deck were busy with men in different coloured T-shirts gassing the planes, loading bombs and machine gun belts, and spotting them on the decks for takeoff. Out of the ready room streamed the pilots and their air crews to man the planes and fly their missions. On June 18th, Admirals Ozawa and Mitcher were searching for each other. The Americans had a string of reports from United States submarines, but search planes had not located the Japanese carrier force. The Japanese had reports from land-based search planes, but were unable to locate the American carriers. The next day, the Japanese found the Americans but did not launch a strike against them. Meanwhile, planes from Tinian and Guam were attacking the Saipan landing force. The nature and effectiveness of the attacks showed what was happening to Japanese land-based air power, which was supposed to make the difference in the Ozawa attempt to wipe out the American fleet. At 10 o'clock on the morning of June 18th, a single Betty approached the Gambier Bay, obviously a self-terminating gesture, which was confirmed 5 minutes later when one of the carrier's combat air patrol planes shot the 2-engine bomber down. From time to time during the day, the torpedo on the bridge reported air activity, but always it was the same: a single or a pair of enemy planes, which were quickly destroyed. At each such report, the flight deck erupted in cheers. The men of the Gambier Bay were bloodthirsty fellows these days, stimulated by patriotism and Navy indoctrination. "Our boys sure don't waste time on these yellow rats," wrote an excited Quartermaster Bell in his diary. This spirit, of course, was necessary for the successful conduct of the war, and was shared in every measure by the Japanese enemy. That day, June 18th, when Composite Squadron 10 torpedo planes attacked the town of Garan with 500 general-purpose bombs, Jess Holman's torpedo bomber was set on fire by anti-aircraft guns. He might have jumped, but he did not know what his crewmen would do, and besides, he was over enemy territory. So Holman kept the plane flying, although the flames were all around burning him. When he reached Tanapag harbour, he ditched successfully, enough that the plane floated long enough to let him search for his aircrew. Neither man was aboard the plane, so he assumed that they must have parachuted and climbed into the rubber raft. From the shore, the Japanese began firing on him and continued until he drifted out beyond their range. He was picked up by a landing craft and rushed to a hospital ship. The crewmen, Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class J. Bacon and Aviation Radioman 3rd Class H. Rivers, were never seen again. They probably did jump and landed behind the Japanese lines. If they were not shot while hanging in their parachutes, they could hardly have survived much longer after landing in the midst of an enemy determined to kill every American they saw. The experience of June 17th had warned Captain Goodwin to expect an attack at dusk, so he ordered a change in the mess schedule. The evening meal would be moved up half an hour to 4:30 in the afternoon. Then, if the Japanese came in at 5 or 5:30 p.m., they would be ready. The idea was sound, but the timing was a little off. The Japanese came early, and at 4:20 p.m. the alarm rang for general quarters. Enemy aircraft were approaching from a distance of 70 miles. Then came other reports, and the fighters scrambled to go up and find the enemy. In the radar room, Lieutenant William Cumming discovered that all these flights were coming onto the screen at the same point. With a little calculation, he saw that they were coming from Guam. So, despite the fast carrier strikes by Admiral Dew Clark's 4-carrier task group on June 12th, the enemy had plenty of striking power left. Only after the war did the Americans learn how crafty the Japanese airmen had been. They camouflaged and hid their aircraft quite successfully, and left out in plain sight mock-ups of Zeros and Bettys made of bamboo and straw. When the pilots came in to bomb and strafe, these planes burned most satisfactorily. As a result, the Americans went back to their carriers to report on scores of aircraft destroyed, when the real figures were only fractions of the number. At least 3 groups of bombers were approaching the Gambier Bay that afternoon. The combat air patrol was up and knocked down several torpedo bombers comfortably away from the carriers, but they could not get them all. Too many of them were coming from too many directions. The combat air patrol radioed that the carriers had best make ready for air attack. They had counted 100 planes in the wave. The Gambier Bay fighters were in a tough spot. They could not engage the Japanese because they had flown for nearly 4 hours and were nearly out of gas. There was only one answer: land the fighters and refuel them. This was dangerous. It meant running the risk of being caught with a deckload of planes and the gas hoses exposed. But it was a risk that had to be taken. The captain gave the orders, and Lieutenant McClendon began landing the fighters in a hurry. Everything went perfectly. There were no wave-offs and no accidents on the flight deck. The chiefs began spotting the planes and refueling. The task was just completed, and the first fighters were in position for takeoff when the men on the flight deck of the Gambier Bay saw the Japanese coming. Lieutenant Patterson ducked behind a deck tractor and watched the 6 torpedo bombers come in at about 100 feet altitude out of the sun. They were about 4 miles away and had obviously set a course directly into the broadsides of the carriers. On the starboard side, Gambier Bay's guns began to fire before the planes came into range, and from the flight deck, Patterson could see the tracers falling short and dropping off like spent Roman candles. As the bombers closed, the gunners began to find the mark, and the tracers' every third shell showed that they were hitting the lead plane. But incredibly, it kept on coming. Then, when it was about a quarter of a mile out, both engines burst into flame, and the plane sailed across the flight deck of the ship as a ball of fire. It was too high to do any damage to the Gambier Bay, but apparently was heading directly for the side of the ship. On the carrier's port side, it misjudged, skimmed across the deck, and plunged into the sea. Commander Huxell was in the radar shack when the first reports came in and counted 100 blips on the screen. As the American fighters went to work, the number of blips decreased, but they scattered, and the fighters had to disperse too. When the bogies were reported just 15 miles off the carrier, Huxell went out onto the catwalk. As he stepped outside, the first Japanese torpedo plane came in over the destroyer screen, heading for the carriers. Some of the fighters were still forward, and the plane handlers were respotting the bay where the planes were assembled for takeoff. There was a mad scramble to get the fighters into the air, and one of them in the way had been shot up in the tail. Section Chief Flanders was looking over a plane when the Japanese began to come in. He ran for the island and the safety of its interior passageway. Meanwhile, a second bomber headed directly across the deck of the Gambier Bay, coming in from the starboard bow. It too was hit and lost control. The plane zoomed up in a steep climb, burst into flames, and went into a spin before breaking off into a gliding dive and plunging straight into the sea. He must have missed by only a few yards. Lieutenant Roby was sitting in his FM-2 fighter on the after end of the flight deck when the Japanese planes zoomed in next to him. A torpedo bomber, which was next to him, was strafed by a Japanese plane. One shell passed through the folded wings of the torpedo bomber and the fuselage before continuing over the deck and out to sea without exploding. Aviation machinist's mate. Third-class PNC was underneath that plane. Feeling gun-shy after the attack, he dropped into the catwalk and hurried into the head, thinking that the steel bulkheads offered more protection than the open deck. There he found Alvin Mackey, the ship's painter, who had the same idea. "Jesus Christ," said Mackey, "somebody could get killed around here." Then he laughed. "If it was us, what would they write home to tell our families? That we got killed in the house?" The pilots were warming their engines as the torpedo bomber came to attack. The other carriers nearby, Kitcon Bay, Coral Sea, and Corregidor, were all firing as the torpedo planes skated in among them. As the first Wildcat took off from the Gambier Bay, enemy bombers were off the ship's bow, and several other ships were firing on them. Ensign Charles Dugan and Ensign Joe McGraw both flew directly into American anti-aircraft fire. Part of the wing of Dugan's Wildcat was shot away, but he managed to climb above the battle and stay in the air. A 20 mm shell struck McGraw's plane just behind his head, tearing away the glass canopy and damaging his flap control mechanism. He too remained in the air. Lieutenant Jean Seitz, pilot of the fourth plane to take off, charged his guns as the plane left the deck with its wheels and flaps still down. He saw an enemy bomber converging on his course, so he left the end of the flight deck, banked left, and fired at a plane 100 yards ahead. It winged over and crashed. Lieutenant Herman Harder climbed out of the friendly barrage safely and saw below him a plane with the Rising Sun insignia trying to escape. He went after it and damaged it, but the plane did not crash. He suddenly found himself engaged with others, but broke off the attack. Lieutenant Bassett's torpedo bomber, coming back from anti-submarine patrol, attacked the Japanese bomber. His turret gunner, aviation machinist's mate third-class Don Blanford, shot the enemy down. Operations continued, and the Gambier Bay kept her combat air patrol in the air. Lieutenant Cumming was reporting bogies all afternoon. Lieutenant Odom and Iman Lai had spent most of the past 2 days in airplot, where they had heard all that was going on and seen the action on the radar, but had not seen any actual Japanese planes. They wanted to have the thrill of seeing them. Odom asked Lieutenant Commander Elmo Waring, the assistant air officer, if they could go up on the flight deck during an attack. Waring was not enthusiastic. "You'd be a lot safer with the flight deck over your head," he observed soberly, but they were insistent, and he was too tired to argue. He was on 24-hour duty and had been for 3 days. Between operations, he napped a little on a camp cot set up in airplot. On June 18th, he was not getting much rest, although Lieutenants Budus and Kuming kept spotting for him. Shortly after the torpedo bomber attack, another group of blips appeared on the screen and on the big plotting board in airplot. Odom watched fascinated as the plane came in. It looked on the board like a big bug crawling across a table. Then, suddenly picking up speed, Waring said it must be a horizontal bomber from the tactic used. Just then, the bomber altered course and sped up even more. Waring said he was sure the Gambier Bay was the plane's target. Iman Lee and Odom went out onto the catwalk to watch. Commander Huxell was on the flight deck looking for enemy planes. He spotted two very high and thought at first they belonged to the Gambier Bay's combat air patrol. But suddenly one peeled off and began to dive. He was standing near the 40 guns forward of the bridge. "Here they come!" he yelled. The 40 guns began firing, but the distance was still too great for the 20 guns. Commander Hubel saw that the lead plane was coming at the Gambier Bay and ducked for cover. He ran for the door leading into the bridge, but men were stacked in there 6 feet deep, so he ran to the after corner of the island and hung out over the flag bag. From that point he was comparatively safe, but could still watch the Japanese plane dive. The ship's guns fired steadily, and smoke and the smell of cordite filled the air. The Japanese plane came on, apparently unhurt, and dropped its bomb. Lieutenant Odom saw the yawning doors of the open bomb bay and watched the plane as the wing waggled. Apparently the pilot could not get the bomb released to operate properly, for although the Betty crossed from starboard to port just forward of the island and barely cleared the radar mast, the bomb dropped 100 feet ahead of the ship. The plane flew on for a second, but the pilot must have been hit because he never pulled out of the dive and went into the water 50 yards off the Gambier Bay's starboard quarter. Just as the spray from the bomb splattered the flight deck all the way back to the island, Odom saw the bomb and the spray, ran into airplot, hurled himself onto Commander Waring's cot, and pulled the mattress up over himself until only the soles of his shoes were visible. That was Lieutenant Odom's primary recollection of the event. He was right behind Lee, and all he could see were those shoes. Commander Huxell came back up toward the island, shaken. Thinking for a moment of that Japanese pilot with the respect of one airman for another, he had to give credit to someone who pressed home an attack that way. As the Japanese attacked, the guns of the Gambier Bay were firing. Quartermaster Bell was at the helm, and Chaplain Carlson was at the loudspeaker recounting the action to those who could hear him. Certainly Seaman Henry Quinn on his 20 gun could not hear in all the noise on the flight deck and in the gun pockets, but down below the engineers and the men on the hangar deck and in damage control could hear. Then suddenly the guns were quiet, and the chaplain's voice rang out, "We got 6 of them." It was growing dark, and Captain Goodwin had many planes in the air. McGraw's plane was in bad shape. It had more than 30 holes in it from friendly fire, no radio, no flaps, and no lights. As the other planes landed, McGraw was told to stay up top and wait. His plane was the most likely to crash on landing, and the procedure was to bring home the healthy planes first. The sick ones could wait if they were not too sick. It was questionable at best whether McClendon and McGraw, combining their skills, could bring the plane down. Lieutenant Roby also had some trouble. His Wildcat had lost its hatch, so he too was left circling above the carriers while the others landed. As darkness increased and several planes suffered damage on landing and fouled up the deck of the Gambier Bay, the captain instructed Robbie and McGraw to land on the Kitkun Bay. Robbie turned, made the approach, and landed on the other carrier on his first pass. McGraw was having more trouble. He made 2 passes at the Kitkun Bay and was waved off both times. Then the landing officer decided that McGraw's Wildcat was a hopeless case and waved him away entirely. It was too late at night, said the Kitkun Bay, to try to take the damaged plane aboard. McGraw then flew back to the Gambier Bay. Ensign Dugan's shot-up fighter had caused part of the trouble, but it had been cleared away. The deck was now clear, but it was almost totally dark, and McGraw faced a virtually impossible landing. Captain Goodwin decided to risk calling enemy attention to the Gambier Bay and ordered the carrier's lights turned on. Ensign McGraw was instructed to bring his damaged Wildcat in on the flight deck, Lieutenant Mack, as he was called, donned his shining coveralls and picked up his iridescent wands. Ensign McGraw began edging the plane down. He had never made a night carrier landing before, and tonight he was coming in at 90 knots, 20 knots faster than normal speed, because he could not operate his flaps. He was further hampered by the wind whistling all around his head in the open cockpit of an airplane not designed to fly that way. Despite these challenges, he brought the Wildcat down. It hit the deck with a bang, bounced up, and crashed into the barrier. All things considered, it was the best landing of the day. With the luck of the Irish, Ensign Joe McGraw walked away from the wreck. Ensign Schroyer came in that evening in his torpedo bomber, but the engine failed as he was in the groove on the last leg of his approach. He landed just astern of the carrier, and all three, pilot, gunner, and radio man, were picked up by an escort. Within 2 hours, all the planes of Composite Squadron 10 were down more or less safely, and operations were suspended for the night. The men had been expecting chow at 4:30 p.m., but it wasn't until 8:30 p.m. that they were squared away. The Gambier Bay carried 30 fighters and bombers, and all but those on the hangar deck under repair had flown several missions during daylight hours. Ensign Dugan, known as Mr. Daring in the squadron, told Intelligence Officer Vine Bell in his debriefing about his first kill. He and Ensign Courtney Leisha, Lieutenant Harders, Gilead and McGraw had spotted a Betty at 24,000 feet. They chased the Japanese plane, which tried to escape by diving toward the deck. Dugan got ahead of the others, and just as he thought he had missed the plane in the gathering darkness, he came upon it head-on. He had fired most of his ammunition in the chase and had just one more burst of 50 mm left. He fired that and watched as the Japanese bomber nosed over and made a beautiful chandelle turn right into the drink. When Lieutenant Bell heard the story told in Dugan's rich Irish accent, with gestures and much laughter, he took Dugan to the captain. The captain was so impressed that he asked Dugan to repeat his star performance over the intercom. For 15 minutes, Dugan relived the story of his day's combat, and the men of the Gambier Bay relived it with him. It had been quite a day. During daylight hours, the pilots flew their planes into enemy territory and got shot up. During nighttime hours, the maintenance men put the planes back together again, or if they were too far gone, pushed them over the side. Theoretically, Commander Bors made the decisions to jettison aircraft, but in practice, Chief Walter Flanders, the leading metalsmith, was the man whose opinion counted. He was very stingy about losing planes, knowing replacements would be hard to come by. Every wreck he could cannibalize meant more security for the ship. But if a plane came in smashed up during flight operations and could not be moved, there was no choice. Over it must go. Chief Flanders's nightmares centered around Air Officer Boris, standing on the bridge with his bullhorn shouting at the mechanics, "Well, make up your minds!" And then came the pain of pushing the injured airplane over the side and watching it splash into the blue sea. Chief Flanders was in charge of metal work for Composite Squadron 10, but since the Gambier Bay did not have a chief metalsmith, he also oversaw the work of the ship's company. Because of this command situation, the Gambier Bay's metal department functioned as well as any in the Navy. This week in battle, some of his men worked 48 hours straight to get a plane back into action. The procedure was to bring a wrecked aircraft down the elevator from the flight deck as soon as possible, and put it in a bay where several men would be assigned to treat its ills: electric, hydraulic, and perhaps a shattered tail section. Chief Flanders would assign metalsmiths Hess, Hewitt, Jones, or Britt to oversee the work on a particular plane, and others would work with them. Sometimes the repairs were nothing short of ingenious. Early in the campaign, one of the fighters came in badly shot up. The ribs in the tail section had been broken. The Gambier Bay did not carry the equipment to make aluminum extrusions for those ribs, but Chief Flanders took a piece of 1-inch angle iron, a razor blade, and a roll of Scotch tape to repair the tail. The next day, the fighter was back in action and flew from the deck of the Gambier Bay until the very last day of her life. On June 19th, action began early for the men of the Gambier Bay. They went to general quarters routinely an hour before dawn. Just before 6 o'clock, several groups of Japanese planes were spotted by radar, and one of them closed in on the carrier formation from 24 miles out. The ship's fighters were directed to the Japanese planes and engaged them, shooting down several, but a few got through. These were Bettys, which did not come down but flew high above the carriers and bombed one of the destroyers. The destroyer shot down a Betty with its 5-inch gun, but the smaller weapons of the carriers could not reach so far. June 19th was the day when the Japanese carriers found the American fleet sandwiched between the Japanese force and Guam and Rota. So far, the AO plan was working perfectly. Admiral Ozawa would dispatch his aircraft from the carriers, they would attack the Americans, land on Guam or Rota to rearm and refuel, and come back to attack again. The shuttle system should have been deadly, but the AO plan had not taken into account the heavy destruction of Japanese aircraft throughout all the Pacific Islands in recent weeks. Guam was supposed to have 500 planes available for AO. Actually, Guam had only 50 operational planes. That morning, as they took off, they were met by fighters from the Belleau Wood, Cabot, Yorktown, and Hornet. Some planes were shot down, some landed, and were immediately rushed into concealment. Americans later discovered a large force of enemy planes coming up from Yap to reinforce Guam. They shot down most of these planes. By mid-morning, Admiral Ozawa had 4 separate attacks in the air heading for the American ships from the Japanese carriers. In all, more than 250 Japanese planes attacked, and the vast majority of them were destroyed. This was the beginning of the Marianas Turkey Shoot, as the flyers called it, or the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as historians would term it. It was fierce and deadly fighting, but aboard the Gambier Bay, nothing would be known of the struggle for 5 days. The escort carriers continued their important job, protecting the transports and warships from aerial attack and destroying enemy air facilities in the Marianas. The American strikes this day were aimed at Tinian to neutralize the airfields there. Ensign Leisha and Lieutenant Richard Roby discovered a Kate bomber just entering the traffic circle over Ushi Airfield on Tinian, and together shot it down. When they came back to tell their tale, Ensign Leisha came in hot, hit the barrier, and his Wildcat flipped over. He reached up, or down in this case, and unlatched the harness, climbing out without a scratch. With his chart in hand, he walked across the flight deck, forgetting that after a landing, the barrier posts were dropped hydraulically to be flush with the flight deck until the next plane came in. He stepped squarely on one of the posts just as it was being raised. It came up fast and catapulted him into a swan dive. Unfortunately, the flight deck was not a comfortable landing place, and Leisha ended up in sick bay having his head stitched. That was an operational accident, as opposed to a combat injury, and entitled him to no separate distinction except for the hoots of his fellow pilots. Another operational accident that day was far more tragic for the men of the Gambier Bay. The carrier was responsible for 2 combat air patrol groups that day. Each patrol was carried out by 4 airplanes, which searched predetermined patterns above the carrier force, ready to be vectored or dispatched to any point. On the orders of the Combat Information Center, Lieutenant Dean Gilead was flying one of the planes of the 2nd Patrol. From the bullhorn on the bridge came the order, "Pilots, man your planes!" The 4 fighter pilots scrambled from the ready room to the flight deck and got into their cockpits. "Stand clear of propellers!" came the next order, and then, "Start engines!" The pilots engaged the starter mechanisms. The engines whined, coughed, and started, and they were ready to launch. Since the fighters were expected to be in the air for an extended period, they were equipped with wing tanks. Normally, the wing tank was attached to the starboard wing of the Wildcat, and the pilot adjusted the controls before takeoff to compensate for the additional weight on that side. However, the plane captain of Gilead's fighter was unable to fix the tank to the starboard wing, so he moved it over to the port wing. He forgot, and so did Lieutenant Gilead, that the plane was trimmed for extra weight on the starboard side when it was actually on the port side. Lieutenant Gilead began a free-run takeoff. The moment the plane started to move, he knew he was in trouble, but the short and narrow deck of the carrier gave him no margin. As the wheels left the deck, the port wing was dropping, and the plane nosed over to the left side of the center line. Despite the pilot's frantic efforts to maintain the proper attitude for takeoff, It seemed that he might just make it. The Wildcat needed only a foot more altitude to clear, but the landing gear caught on the top of a portside 40 gun mount just forward of the island. The plane was sent over the side into the sea at a 40-degree angle. The plane went down but surfaced horizontally, as if flying on the sea. The crash alarm sounded just as it became apparent that Gilead was going to hit the gun. Commander Huxell was in the ready room and rushed to the catwalk, coming outside just as the ship passed by the floating plane. He could see Gilead in the cockpit, his head slumped forward on his chest, unmoving. Either he had broken his neck on impact or had been knocked out. As the ship moved past the wreck, men on the flight deck prayed that the pilot would come to and unsnap the safety belts, but they passed by and the plane sank. When the escort arrived, the sea was empty. Lieutenant Harders, Gilead's best friend aboard the Gambier Bay, stood on the catwalk outside the orology office, watching with Lieutenant Odom. Tears streamed down Harders' cheeks. "Oh, why couldn't it have been me instead of Gil? He had so much to live for," sobbed the flyer. Gilead had married during the frantic war years and had learned just before leaving for the war that his wife was about to have a baby. There was no more to say. The call came from the Bullhorn for another pilot. The Combat Air Patrol required 4 planes, and only 3 were in the air. In a moment, another fighter pilot was manning his plane and soon took off, replacing Lieutenant Gilead. The demands of war left no place for personal sorrow. The Combat Air Patrols encountered a few Japanese planes and shot them down. Each time a plane fell, the word was passed around the ship, and the men of the Gambier Bay cheered. "Those yellow bastards are taking a licking but don't seem to know when they are licked," wrote the bloodthirsty Quartermaster Bell in his diary, unmindful of the tribute he was paying to Japanese bravery. As the battle clearly turned against the defenders of Saipan, their courage became increasingly desperate. Each plane shot down was a potential missile, and as the days went by, the men of the Gambier Bay noticed a changed approach by the enemy. On June 19th, Japanese pilots began trying to crash their falling aircraft into American ships. These were not kamikaze. That development was yet to come. These were brave warriors of the Emperor giving their lives for their country, trying to make their lives count to the last. By the night of June 19th, the men of the Gambier Bay were worn out after 5 consecutive days and nights of battle. They did not know then, but the Marianas Turkey shoot of Admiral Mitch's force was decimating the enemy. Admiral Ozawa would lose 92% of his carrier planes, and most of the Guam planes he had counted on. The Gambier Bay's troubles with Japanese air attacks at Saipan were over. On June 19th, many of the Japanese aircraft from Guam and Rota had attacked the invasion fleet off Saipan, but as the Turkey shoot continued, all available planes were sent to help Admiral Ozawa and his carriers. Thus, on June 20th, when the Battle of the Philippine Sea was at its height, the escort carriers and other ships of the invasion fleet were virtually left alone. A few Japanese snoopers came around during the day, but these were almost certainly observation craft, which made no attempt to attack. The beachhead had been secured by the Marines, and the Army's 27th Division began landing elements of its infantry combat teams on June 19th. General Holland Smith took command of the ground forces from Admiral Turner. The Japanese faced certain defeat as the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended in an American victory, but Japanese Commander General Saito was determined to fight to the end. Even after the enormous destruction of Japanese planes in the Turkey shoot, the Japanese were able to mount a few attacks from the air, some as far away as Truk. The battleship Maryland was torpedoed, and a raid on the American-held anchorage at Chirankanoa caused damage to several ships. After June 19th, no enemy aircraft managed to enter the defensive area of the carrier fleet offshore, but that did not mean the Gambier Bay's task was completed. The Marines and Army troops ashore still faced tough going against determined defenders and needed air support in case of enemy air attacks. On June 20th and 21, the Gambier Bay launched its fighters, but no bombers. On June 22nd, the ship did not conduct any aerial operations. The hunting was definitely slowing down. On June 28th, Admiral Salad's task group moved around to the west side of the island to help the Marines, who needed support as the army forces had bogged down in a drive on Mount Tapatao, the highest point on Saipan. The situation was serious enough that General Holland Smith relieved Army General Ralph Smith of command of the 27th Division, but the change of command did not speed the drive. Japanese resistance became fiercer and more self-destructive. Mount Tapatao was not captured until June 27th. The next day, General Smith called for help from the carriers, and torpedo bombers were brought out to conduct selective bombing. On June 29th, Commander Huxell and Lieutenant Pizarski shared one exciting mission. The Marines were advancing on the town of Garapan, crossing a series of ridges contested by the Japanese, whose mortar and machine gun fire was highly effective. Huxell and Pizarski flew each torpedo bomber carrying 10 100-pound anti-personnel bombs. They were directed by the ground controller to the area to be bombed. Each plane made 2 dummy passes down the ravine where the Japanese were holding up, shooting at the Marines coming up the other side, then made final passes and dropped the bombs. They never knew how effective their bombardment had been, but found it satisfying to be so close to the action that they could feel the concussion of their own bomb bursts. Despite bombing the Chiran Kanua sugar mill on Saipan, the tall smokestack of the factory still stood because higher authority had cautioned the pilots against bombing it. They wanted to save the stack as the base for a radio aerial. The plan was already in motion to make Saipan a major base for B-29 bombing of Japan, and the CBS were ashore building the extra-long airstrips before the last snipers were wiped out around the runways. As the battle continued and General Saito's forces resisted strongly, it became apparent that Japanese aerial observation of Marine movements was still a threat. Army ground movements were extremely accurate. Since the Japanese had no spotter planes in the area, they must have had an observer located on some high point. Commander Huxell suspected that it was the smokestack and requested permission to knock it down, but permission was refused. The Gambier Bay had its duties to perform, and Composite Squadron 10 needed to focus on those tasks. On June 20th, Admiral Salada took the Kitkun Bay and Gambier Bay east of Saipan to pick up 2 convoys of supply ships and escort them to anchorage off Saipan. No air attacks were made in support of the troops for the next 3 days. Composite Squadron 10 fighters flew air patrols and found no enemy aircraft, while the torpedo bombers conducted anti-submarine patrol missions and found no submarines. On June 22nd, the destroyer Baham reported a torpedo wake passing under her stem, but she was not hit. That same night, a lone Japanese bomber came in on Chiran Kanoa roads, where the battleships were anchored, firing in support of the ground troops. The Betty dropped a torpedo that hit the Maryland and quickly escaped before a gun could be fired. The battleships had become careless, and Admiral Oldendorf, commander of the fire support unit, was nearly blasted the next night when another Betty dropped a stick of bombs that landed just behind his flagship, the cruiser Louisville. June 23rd marked the virtual end of effective Japanese air harassment. On that day, Army Air Force P-47S arrived at ASO Airfield, which was rechristened Ely Airfield after a Navy pilot killed earlier in the operation. The following day, a group of P-61 night fighters equipped with radar arrived, putting an end to the effective Japanese effort after dark. The Gambier Bay was not called upon for airstrikes against land targets again until June 28th. By this time, all the fighting forces had heard about the success of the fast carriers in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and morale had never been higher. "It sure does feel nice to be on the giving end of the war instead of the receiving end, as I always was before I came aboard this ship," wrote Quartermaster Bell in his diary. It had been dull duty, flying combat air patrols where there was no combat and anti-submarine missions where there were no submarines. The only excitement had been operational Ensign McGraw's fighter, which got into trouble when he jettisoned his detachable wing tank, causing it to slice off a piece of the fighter's horizontal stabilizer. McGraw could only control the plane with shallow banks and turns. Leo Zola, flying on McGraw's wing, stayed with him all the time, but as they approached the carrier, Zola became very noisy. "I wanted wings until I got them, but now I don't want them anymore," he sang over the radio. Meanwhile, McGraw was trying to get into the traffic circle. The maneuver required sharp rudder and elevator adjustments, and the crippled Wildcat wouldn't handle them. McGraw had been waved off twice by Landing Signal Officer McClendon. Down on the deck, where the maneuvering was being piped into the address system from the Combat Information Center, nearly everyone agreed with McGraw. Zola and Ensign Leisha were known for their antics, and this time Zola didn't speak up, knowing McGraw was in trouble. On the deck and bridge, Commander Huxell, Commander Boris, and Captain Goodwin advised McGraw on all the tricks they knew, but none worked. Captain Goodwin eventually told McGraw he would either have to ditch or parachute. McGraw had never jumped before, but he decided to parachute. Although ship captains didn't like that solution due to the risk of an unattended aircraft becoming a guided missile, in this case, Ensign McGraw parachuted, and the Wildcat disappeared over the horizon. A destroyer picked up the pilot almost immediately. By June 27th, American control of Saipan was evident when General Holland Smith climbed Mount Tapotao, where the Japanese had built a shrine. From the highest point on the island, General Smith could see all around him. Although 80% of the Japanese defending force had been destroyed, the Japanese were determined to fight to the last. They still had a few tanks and artillery pieces. General Saito established a final line of resistance from Tanapag to the eastern shore of the island. With the enemy cornered in the narrow north end of the island, General Smith decided to make more use of naval gunfire and air support. At the same time, Composite Squadron 10 was tasked with beginning the softening up process against Tinian, which would soon be invaded. June 28th marked the end of leniency for the pilots and the men of the ship. The fighters strafed, and the bombers hit Garapan and Tanapag, targeting areas called out by spotters. Japanese troops were staging self-destructive attacks, and Japanese civilians continued to leap from Mapai Point, which the Navy had nicknamed Banzai Cliff. Admiral Salada heard about the self-destructive actions and decided he wanted photos for the record. Composite Squadron 5, the flagship's air squadron, had lost its photoplane, so he called on Composite Squadron 10 to take the pictures. Ensign R.L. Crocker had just returned the photoplane from an anti-submarine patrol. The engine had been running rough, and Crocker had trouble getting home. He signalled that the plane was inoperable and needed a major inspection. Captain Goodwin, unaware of this development, ordered the plane onto the flight deck ready for launch, with Lieutenant Pisarski to pilot it and Chief Sparrow to take the pictures. Pisarski, who was also the engineering officer of Composite Squadron 10, was upset that his judgment was overruled for what he saw as the Admiral's personal vanity and the captain's toadyism. He argued with Commander Huxell, who agreed but pointed out that the captain's direct order meant he had no choice but to fly the mission. Pisarski asked if the plane's depth charges could be unloaded to lighten it, but was told there was no time. Finally, the plane captain ran the engine at high RPMs and gave a thumbs-up signal, and the mission was approved. Pisarski, however, was furious. Not only was his judgment overruled, but he was expected to fly a plane he believed was not operational. Despite his concerns, the plane took off for the mission. PC ordered his gunner, Robert Jensen, out of the gun turret. Only the radio man, Falls, would accompany him if Chief Sparrow needed all the equipment to take the pictures. Pisarski put on his helmet and goggles and prepared to take off. He revved up the engine as Lieutenant Pilgrim operated the catapult, and the plane launched from the flight deck, skimming low over the water as heavy planes typically did. After the plane was launched, flight operations were suspended, and the Gambier Bay was secured for lunch. No one noticed that the torpedo bomber never rose more than 25 feet above the sea, and after travelling about 2 miles, the plane finally gave up altogether. Pisarski made a controlled water landing. Radioman Falls pulled a sputtering Chief Sparrow from the tunnel, and they quickly got into the rubber raft. A destroyer was hastening toward them. As the destroyer approached, Pisarski realized that the crash might have damaged the depth charges, which could pose a risk. He signaled the destroyer to stand by, and it moved to one side. The raft was directly in the path of the Gambier Bay, which was nearly empty for lunch, including the lookouts. The carrier came so close that when one of the depth charges went off, it shook the entire ship. The destroyer picked up the plane's crew and sent them back to the Gambier Bay. Buzz Boris and the plane captain were the first to congratulate Pisarsky on the narrow escape, which he considered entirely their fault. His mood worsened when Boris informed him that the captain wanted to see him. Captain Goodwin, feeling that Pisarsky might be responsible for the depth charge explosion on the bridge, threatened him with a court-martial for insubordination and practically accused him of sabotaging the mission. The argument quickly escalated, almost resulting in 2 court-martials instead of 1. Commander Boris intervened, ordering Pisarsky to his quarters for rest. The captain grounded Pisarsky for 2 weeks, though that didn't last long. Less than an hour later, a call came for a special anti-submarine search. Lieutenant Cumming had spotted some strange blips on the radar screen, and someone needed to investigate. Commander Boris decided it was best to get Pisarsky off the ship for a while, and this mission was lengthy. Pisarsky took off again for the second time in 2 hours. As the flight crew prepared the torpedo bomber for catapult launch, Commander Boris gave a thumbs up. Lieutenant Pisarsky responded by grabbing his nose between thumb and forefinger and delivering a salute that looked like a 5-fingered gesture. Either Captain Goodwin didn't see it, or, upon Pisarsky's return from the 4.5-hour mission, had calmed down. The immediate result was that Chief Sparrow was so impressed with himself that he founded the Dunners Club, whose members had all survived water landings. Pisarsky and other pilots continued flying mostly missions against Tinian in late June and early July. Some Saipan points still needed attention, so fighters and bombers worked over gun positions and troop concentrations. Meanwhile, the planes were growing tired and required shore maintenance and engine changes. On June 30th, Lieutenant Stewart returned to the squadron. He had been brought back to Saipan by a destroyer and sent ashore to Isel ASO airfield. After spending a night there and acquiring a samurai sword, he was picked up by a torpedo plane and flown back to the Gambier Bay. Stewart had an interesting tale. On D-Day, his plane was shot down by a freak incident. As he nursed it out to sea, he noticed only a small hole in the cowling 18 inches ahead of the cockpit. An oil line had ruptured, causing pressure to drop and temperature to rise. Realizing he wouldn't make it 60 miles back to the carrier, he found a destroyer beyond the transports, made a water landing, and the Wildcat sank. He jumped out, climbed along the wing, and then the wing fell away, leaving him bobbing alone. He managed to get into a rubber boat after several flips. The destroyer sent a swimmer to get him, and he was pulled aboard with a line. This marked the beginning of his adventure. Shortly after, the destroyer he was on was ordered to make smoke during a Japanese air attack. Stewart had expected to be sent back to the carrier, but that evening the destroyer was pulled from the invasion force to join Admiral Mitchell's attack on the Japanese fleet. Stewart became the destroyer's air intelligence officer, identifying aircraft as friend or foe and relieving junior officers at the decoding machines. He had a ringside seat at the Marianas Turkey Shoot, where Americans hit Japanese carriers, sinking the Hayo and several smaller ships, and damaging the Zuikaku so severely that it was nearly abandoned. The flight deck of the carrier Koda was wrecked, and on the night of that attack, with carrier planes running low on fuel, Admiral Mitchell ordered ship lights turned on, though some planes didn't make it. Stewart's destroyer spent 2 days looking for downed seamen before returning to the fleet. On June 30th, Lieutenant Stewart rejoined the Gambier Bay. Captain Goodwin welcomed him aboard, asked a few questions, and then turned the ship's intercom over to Stewart to share his tale of the turkey shoot, which he did for 45 minutes. The next day, July 1st, the fighters and bombers of Composite Squadron 10 were sent to strafe the remains of the Japanese force east of Garapan and the gun positions still standing at Marpi Point. They also attacked caves around the point where Japanese soldiers had hidden for their last stand. On July 2nd, Captain Goodwin found a use for the 1,000-pound bomb autographed by Miss Beatty, a fortified Japanese command post. The torpedo pilots held a lottery to see who would deliver Miss Beatty's personal message to Premier Tojo. Ensign Crocker won the lottery and, along with gunner Charles Westbrook and Larry Austin, delivered the bomb on target. Afterward, Ensign Crocker wrote to Miss Beatty about the date she owed him. Captain Goodwin, reflecting on the performance of his men, was pleased with their adaptability and courage. He sent a message to Admiral King in Washington, praising the relatively inexperienced crew of the Gambier Bay for exceeding expectations. 6 months earlier, the vessel had just been commissioned, with 97% of the crew having never been in action and 85% seasick on their first voyage. Now they had the appearance and confidence of seasoned veterans, and their conduct under attack was exemplary. This message was duly posted for the men of the Gambier Bay. Even Lieutenant Pizarski was pleased by the captain's praise. The battle at Saipan and Tinian was over for the Gambier Bay. Admiral Salada had decided that the attrition of aircraft had rendered the Kitcon Bay and Gambier Bay of limited usefulness for the remainder of the operation. They needed a rest, but more importantly, they required new aircraft and fresh pilots and aircrew to fill the gaps left by the war. So, on the very afternoon of Ensign Crocker's strike with the 1,000-pound bomb, the Gambier Bay was ordered to set an easterly course for Eniwetok in the Marshall Islands. The first battle had ended for the men of the Gambier Bay, and as the order to withdraw to Eniwetok came, the atmosphere aboard the ship became more relaxed than it had been for the past 3 weeks. The men began dreaming of shore leave, maybe a beer bust, and the prospect of rest. Eniwetok, having been an American base for over 4 months, was expected to have some shore facilities by this time. Captain Goodwin took a break from his frequent criticisms of Commander Huxell, and Commander Boris eased up on his reprimands of Ensign Zola and Lieutenant Leisha, who were not flying any more missions or combat air patrols at the moment. Instead, Boris spent much of his time playing basketball on the hangar deck, where he was the most skilled ball handler on the ship. He also made many mysterious trips to a crew shelter beneath the flight deck, the hangout of Chief Montgomery and his crew. They had an ancient hot plate in this shelter, whose original heating element had long since burned out. They made a new one almost every day from stainless steel aircraft safety wire. Each element lasted about 24 hours, but they had plenty of safety wire aboard. They also had ample coffee, courtesy of the galley cooks, but the real shortage was fresh water. The Gambier Bay, a small ship with a large crew and faulty condensers, had water rationed at all times. The fresh water taps in the crew spaces were turned off most of the day, though some sections of officers' country kept theirs on. Chief Montgomery's problem was to beguile an officer into fetching water for them in a No. 10 bean can. Initially, everyone in Montgomery's crew tried their hand at making coffee. Some of it was wonderful, some not so good, and some was just plain lousy. Eventually, the coffee-making was entrusted to aviation electrician's mate 3rd Class Eugene Martin, a small man from Oklahoma who had mastered the art of boiling coffee in a bean can. When the wind was right, Martin's coffee could be smelled all the way up to the Fly One space in the island where Buzz Boris kept his office. Everyone swore Martin's coffee was as good as the captain's, and much easier to obtain. Boris would head for the Airedale shelter, fetch a can of water, and get a cup of coffee and a roll or two snagged from the chief petty officer mess. One day, Montgomery was relaxing with a cup of coffee in the shelter when he was paged on the flight deck bullhorn. He dashed out to report to Air Officer Boris. "Chief," Boris said solemnly, "do you have any of that good coffee?" The trip back to Eniwetok was indeed relaxed. Composite Squadron 10's fighters, being in rough shape, were not asked to supply any combat air patrols on the way back, only anti-submarine patrols with the torpedo bombers. A day or so before they reached Eniwetok, all the fighters were assessed and tested. For a week, metal smiths and mechanics had been working on them. Commander Boris had 11 of them flown off. 6 passed the test, and 5 were sent to Eniwetok, either to be dispatched back to the United States as war-weary, or to be overhauled by shore facilities that could manage the job. On July 10th, the Gambier Bay anchored at Eniwetok. There was no shore leave, which was an unpleasant surprise for the men, but there was little time for complaints. The crew had to take on supplies, ammunition, and new aircraft to replace the worn-out planes. They were busy loading for the next 24 hours. Most of the pilots spent their time in the ready room, reading, playing cards, or writing letters. Lieutenant John Sanderson wrote a poem celebrating the various characters of flight deck life. Carrier life is something we've all heard people say, if you've missed this grand experience, get your transfer in today. But when it comes to flying, you can put me on the shore. For life on an escort carrier is something worse than war. They get you up at 3 o'clock with a whistle and a bell, and you stand by in the ready room, just sleepier than hell. Word is passed to man the planes, and you race out on the double. When the word is passed to go, there's no end of trouble. You'll be sitting in the cockpit when Boris says, "Fly off." You jam the throttle forward, and the engine starts to cough. You go rolling down the deck, but you always feel the need for just one extra knot to keep above your stalling speed. Whether you're on airstrike patrol or combat air patrol, your gas is almost gone, and your bell is just a hole. You'd like to eat, but your plane and you have both been cruising lean. Airplot says to orbit. There's a bogey on the screen. Sometimes we're told to scramble, and you go charging to your plane, but you sit there for 20 minutes while the shrapnel falls like rain. Then the enemy is gone, and the Admiral says, "Let 'em go," so you retire with your gear to the ready room below. They put you in the catapult and secure you in the gear. Pilgrim sticks his finger up and looks up with a leer. You're drawing 40 mil when Charlie points away, and you hope to hell you've got the power to get in the air and stay. It's when you're landing back aboard that you find it really rough. You're high, you're fast, you're low. Christ, that's slow enough. You're cut, you're on the gear. The poem was greeted with jeers and laughter. Sanderson was acclaimed as the poet laureate of the Gambia Bay, and the poem was saved. Not all the officers and men of the squadron could take it quite that easily. Commander Huxell and Chief Montgomery went to the beach with Commander Boris to get some planes to replace the weary ones. Boris managed to negotiate one new FM2, but the old, tired ones he thought should be dumped had to serve again. They did better with the torpedo bombers, unloading 3 of the worst ones and getting 6 new torpedo bombers in return to make up for Peasy's lost photoplane. Holman and Schroer's buzz. Boris looked at all the brand-new fighters sitting there on the flight line. To get one, you had to present the aircraft logbook that was given out when a pilot showed up to claim a plane. They walked into the operations office and saw that the desk was piled high with logbooks. Commander Boris reached over and selected a logbook, slipping it to Chief Montgomery. They all marched over to the flight line and took over the planes listed in the logbooks. Commander Boris signed for all of them, including the Perrind plane.